I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's April 29th, and welcome to the 400th episode of RealTalk MS. I'll be the first to admit that it seems pretty unbelievable. When I started this journey of talking and sharing and learning, I never imagined we'd be here. And honestly, the only reason we've reached this milestone is you. Your engagement is what fuels this show. So I want to take a moment and extend a huge, heartfelt thank you to every single person who listens to RealTalk MS, whether you've been with us since episode number 1 or you just found us last week. You're the reason this community exists and thrives. I also want to thank the hundreds of incredible guests who have shared their time, expertise, or personal stories with us. In 400 episodes, no one has ever said no when I've asked them for an interview. Their willingness to be open and informative is the reason this podcast continues to work. It's been my absolute honor to bring you insights from leading experts, researchers, clinicians, advocates, and perhaps most importantly, from people living with MS themselves. In nearly 8 years of consistent conversations, we've covered everything from the latest research and treatments to the daily realities and emotional challenges that come with living with MS. Our goal has always been to cut through the jargon and noise and provide clear, easy to understand, and reliable information for the MS community. Reaching 400 episodes feels like a testament to the need for that ongoing conversation. So thank you for listening every week, for sharing the podcast, for sending your emails, your DMs, and questions. Here's to the first 400 episodes, but I have no intention of stopping here. We're excited to continue bringing you the information and conversations that matter most to the MS community. And in the interest of full disclosure, I'll admit that I'm already thinking about the party we'll have to have when we hit episode number 500. When I began to plan this episode, I stopped to consider who might be the ideal guest. About 9 months ago, Dr. Tim Coetzee was named President and CEO of the National MS Society. And although Tim joined me on the podcast after having been on the job for about a week and a half, I thought it was the ideal time to have him back to share his vision for the MS Society and the broader MS community. And I thought hearing from Tim was especially important as we're seeing these dramatic federal agency staff and funding cuts that will have an impact on the MS community. In a moment, we'll meet my guest for episode 400 of RealTalk MS, Dr. Tim Coetzee. Dr. Tim Coetzee is the president and CEO of the National MS Society, and my first choice to join me for this 400th episode of RealTalk MS. Welcome back to the podcast, Tim.
Hey, John, 400 episodes. Congratulations. Great to be with you.
Well, thanks for that. You know, as I just mentioned, today marks a 400th episode of this podcast, but it isn't the only anniversary we should be talking about. In just a couple of days, May 1st, it'll mark the 80th anniversary of the day that Sylvia Lowry posted a short ad in the New York Times. Now, I won't ask you to take us through 80 years of history, but I'm hoping you'll talk about that tiny ad that ended up really changing everything for people with MS.
John, you know how I love talking about origin stories, so I'm thrilled to talk about that small little ad that's Sylvia Lowry placed in the New York Times. So really, it's great to be back with you and your audience to celebrate that. So let me start by just sort of noting and setting the stage. So for your audience who may not be as deeply familiar with Sylvia's story, she was, really the head of the household for her and her brother's difficult family situation that she was in. And it was in the early 40s, height of World War II, when her brother Bernard was diagnosed with MS. And you can imagine there weren't a lot of neurologists around at that time. The care was kind of spotty. We know from historical records that diseases like this, that like MS and others where there were no treatments, oftentimes the doctors wouldn't even tell the patients what the diagnosis was because there was there's nothing we can do about it, so why tell them? In Sylvia's case, no, she told Bernard, and, they did their best to try to really figure things out. But she also kept bumping into roadblocks to the healthcare system, doctors who really were like, I have nothing for you. Just please go home, put your affairs in order. That led to her being severely frustrated and deciding, I'm going to see if anyone else is out there has solutions for this disease. And so she decided to go that the place to go was the social media of the time, the classifieds of the New York Times, which really, if your audience is interested, just go back and look at what the classifieds were like back in those days. It truly was like the social media of today. And so she determined that she was going to actually put this ad in. Turns out, we see it today as though she was successful. They denied her twice. They wouldn't take her money. They basically thought that she was a grifter, trying to scam people. And she finally persuaded them that, yes, this is a serious thing. She's not a grifter. And she put in this ad that basically was 11 words that said multiple sclerosis. Will anyone recovered from it? Please contact patient, and had the mailbox. And she went down to this mailbox every day, gathering up responses. And about 50 people wrote back to her. And then they decided to gather and form this little community that then went out and formed the National MS Society just a few months later. This was May 1st, 1945, too, right at the end of World War II. So you can imagine what the world was like. But, for her, I've taken to describing this ad as an act of love for her brother. She was so frustrated by what the disease was doing to her brother. And she went out to her community and asked, has anybody found solutions to that? And that gave rise to the National MS Society. It's a remarkable story, and there's other elements of it that I can get into that follow it, if you'd like.
Well, I know that one of the things that makes this such a remarkable story is the fact that she was a woman. And in 1945, women did not take the lead in, pretty much anything in public. Their job was to stay home and take care of the house and take care of the kids.
Yeah, that you are right about characterizing the era of the time. And, in our offices, there are these pictures in various places we have to remember her contributions. And all the pictures are Sylvia and with a bunch of men. She was just so determined to do something for Bernie, to make sure that Bernie could find the solution. So she gathered up 20 of the experts on an MS in the United States and created our first medical advisory committee. And she would go to doctors. She would go to lawmakers, and she would just pound the pavement, as we would say, to get the people we need to try to make a difference for her brother. And that didn't stop in the United States. She went to the United Kingdom, went to Canada. She went where she needed to try to find solutions, because she was just so determined to try to find that cure and also find the support people with MS needed. And one of the things that really is so remarkable about that story is the ad was placed in 1945. The National MS Society was formed as an organization on March 11th, 1946, so not that much longer after. And then we made our first 2 grants as the National MS Society to fund research in July 1947. And in today's dollars, those commitments were almost $1 million in today's money. Now you imagine, just scrappy group of 50 people going out at the end of a World War when the economy was still pretty much in shambles, raising money, being determined. And the incredible thing about that first grant, which is what inspires me, is that they had no way of knowing. They believed in science. They believed in the possibility of finding solutions. That first grant went to a Dr. Alvin Cabot at Columbia University, who was studying the spinal fluid of people affected by MS. And he made the discovery that people with MS have these things called oligoclonal bands in their spinal fluid. That grant made that discovery. Today, when a doctor says to a person and he's thinking about a diagnosis of MS, and he's sometimes not entirely sure, is it MS, is it not MS? One of the things they do is do a spinal tap and measure whether or not there are oligoclonal bands, because oligoclonal bands are an indicator that a person has MS. And can you imagine that first grant made in 1947 in 2025 still is is having a profound effect from this day. Those folks couldn't have known it, but the way I've taken to describing it is they did believe in the power of science, the power of people coming together to support funding innovative new ideas, and the possibility that it could change the world for people affected by MS. And, who knows what may be possible today with the kinds of work we're doing as the National MS Society and other organizations that are a part of our movement.
Well, let's fast forward from the origin of the MS Society to about 9 months ago when you were named president and CEO. How would you characterize your first several months leading the MS Society?
They've been energizing, an incredible experience. I am so fortunate to be able to work with volunteers like yourself and people from, so many leadership volunteers around the country who are, joining forces with me to be able to try to really, finish Sylvia's work. We had the opportunity to launch a new awareness campaign. We call it MS Ends With Us. And, it's been just really so inspiring to be around so many people. It's great, people wishing me well and what can we do? How can we get energized? But also part of it for me has been also to tell the story of what I hope will be the work that we can create and really what could be the last chapter of MS. And for me, I've, started to really focus in on asking our community to imagine a world with me where we could have four things. The first thing I want to see is a world where a person who's experiencing those symptoms that might be MS can go see a doctor and can be diagnosed as either having or not having MS within a few hours, rather than the months or years that have characterized things for people. That would be an awesome world. And then, if that person does have MS, I'd love to see a world where they can have the right treatment for where they are in their MS disease journey for their type of MS that's also affordable. That would be a pretty awesome world. We have a lot of treatments today. Some of them are very expensive. Not all of them are for the different parts of MS where people are. So we need to change that. The third thing I'd like to see is a world where people have guides that can walk alongside them to help them navigate the uncertainties of MS. That would be, really an amazing world. And then the last pillar, as I call it, would be, can we imagine a world where the diagnosis of MS isn't anything to fear because we have a cure? For me, those four declarations are consistent with Sylvia's original ad, like, has anybody recovered from this? Get in touch with me. And, I consider it a privilege to have the possibility of, closing that chapter on the book that is MS.
Well, while we're talking about ending MS, can you talk about the most interesting or exciting advancements in MS research that the Society is funding?
Sure. So obviously we're very passionate about trying to fund research through our Pathways to Cures roadmap, which has 3 pillars: stopping progression, restoring function, and then ending MS forever. When I think about the stopping progression, one of the really important pieces that we need to get at is what is happening in the disease when people, for example, haven't had a single relapse for a long time. They haven't had any new lesions, and the doctor says, but you're doing great. And the person says, yeah, but I'm not doing great. I've lost a step. My 25-foot time walk, if that's how people measure, is faster. I'm slower. And it's not just because I'm older. I really know that I'm not where I'm at. So this really important aspect of that, we know that there are parts of MS, the biology of MS, that we haven't figured out, is some of the work that we're really focused in on. Some of your audience might know it as progression independence of relapse activity, PIRA, the name. Well, only scientists could come up with a name like that, right?
Right.
There are other things for it, but the the ability to say, yes, we haven't cracked all the parts of the MS code. This is something that we have to tackle. That's one of the areas that we're particularly focused on. We're funding research and repairing myelin. I am continuing to be very excited about the possibility that we will have myelin repair therapies in our future. There are several clinical trials happening now. Those are built on early foundational studies that the National MS Society funded. But now I'm really excited about, our ability to try to interrogate and understand what are the different facets of myelin repair. When is myelin repair needed? You don't always necessarily need to be rebuilding the brain, only at certain times. Can you figure out what are those signals that need to turn it on and off? And then another area that I'm really interested in, obviously, is ending the disease. So, are there viral triggers? Can we prevent the disease from ever happening? We've funded some research into EBV, which I'm sure have a lot of faithful listeners who are very interested in EBV.
Oh, yes.
But now I think it's the important piece is to go beyond that to say, okay, fine, you've identified a potential causal agent. What would be the strategy by which you actually can prevent the disease? Is it a vaccine strategy, which some doctors have talked about? Is there a vaccination strategy? Are there more specific strategies around that? So I think that there's some work that our friends at the Canadian MS Society and Australian MS Societies and us are all joining forces to try to understand what would be required to get at prevention. I'm also excited about the research that is also looking at who is at risk of developing MS. And we know, for example, that people who develop MS oftentimes start interacting with the healthcare system more frequently than someone who doesn't develop MS. And right now, there's not a particular pattern of things. And this is where I think we need big data, scientists coming together, sharing information to figure out, is there some sort of combination lock, to use for lack of a better word, that says this combination of symptoms says that this person is at risk of developing MS, and let's start treating them before they even have any symptoms. I mean, that to me, we get to that world, we're right next to figuring out what's the trigger. So those some of the big picture things. Also, there are other themes in terms of emerging areas that are important to us. Aging with MS and what it means to get older with the disease. We haven't studied that enough. Work by the International Clinical Trials Committee has highlighted that as a need, and we'll be publishing some papers in that. The area of women's health in MS, there's a lot of gaps in women's health and the intersection of women's health and MS. And this is one of those areas that has been understudied. And so we're planning on making some investments there. And then obviously more broadly, you're aware of the work that we're doing related to the new diagnostic criteria for MS, and the work we're doing internationally to come up with a more biologically based way to describe MS, what we call the course descriptors for MS. That work is ongoing. A long-term project for sure, but one that I'm really excited that will lead to some transformation in the future. Well, so a few things here or there.
There are a few things. A few minutes ago, you mentioned the number of disease-modifying therapies that are available, and you alluded to the reality that all of them aren't right for everyone. And so with that increasing number of DMTs, it becomes a little tricky for someone living with MS to try to start to understand what might be a good fit. So what are the Society's recommendations or resources for individuals who are trying to navigate treatment decisions?
So one of the best resources that I can recommend, and allow me to declare my conflict of interest right out of the gate, would be the National MS Society's website. We've done quite a bit of our work with our healthcare access team to lay out the different treatment options, the different ways that a person can get the treatment, whether it's an injectable, a pill, an infusion. What are some of the pluses and minuses that somebody should consider? And we also work to try to make that as user-friendly as possible, because, when you're handed a bunch of brochures at your doctor's office, it's It's a lot of very fine print to try to read through.
Right.
And so that's one of the important ways that, I would recommend people visit our website, give us content, and obviously give us feedback. If we're not getting it quite right, we're always happy to learn where we can continue to refine and improve it. We work hard to keep those as up to date as possible. Again, declaring my conflict of interest, but I would recommend that your listeners go there.
My conflict perhaps is not quite as overt, and I would have to say I couldn't agree more. And I know that when people think about managing MS, certainly disease-modifying therapies are one of the very first things they think about. But the society has also done research and work on promoting the benefit of rehab, of exercise, physical activity, kind of the holistic approach to managing MS.
Absolutely. And that is actually an important aspect of, I think, of living well with MS, is that being with a doctor that knows MS, that knows you as a patient, because that's really important, making sure you and your doctor are a team and that there's a team around you, that the person to support them with the disease modifying treatment that's appropriate for them. But then the other leg in that stool is well-being. Thinking about diet, exercise. If a doctor recommends rehabilitation interventions, whether physical or cognitive, because both are available to people, are also important facets of living well while living with the diagnosis of MS. I cannot emphasize that enough. That's an important part of our research strategy, is to focusing in on that. We also, as part of our focus on progressive MS, which is a really understudied area, are also, focusing in on rehabilitative interventions, whether physical, cognitive, or other tools, as part of navigating and creating a better quality of life for those people who live with progressive MS today while they wait for those progressive MS treatments to come. And so we know that there are gaps in interventions, rehabilitative interventions for people with progressive MS. And so through the Progressive MS Alliance, we've actually invested in quite a bit of research to try to fill some of those gaps, to bring solutions to people with progressive forms of the disease today. But I'll also say that some of those interventions will also be very applicable to people with relapsing forms of MS. It's not one or the other. And it is really an important area and a priority for us at the National MS Society.
We're living through an interesting time here in the United States, and while much of the public's attention is currently focused on tariffs, science, medical research, and the federal agencies that have traditionally provided regulatory oversight for medicine and healthcare research have been profoundly impacted by thousands of layoffs and billions in terminated funding. In fact, the MS research program, which represents the only direct federal funding for MS research, has been defunded this year. What are your thoughts about what's already taken place, and how do you foresee the effects of these dramatic cuts?
They're painful, no doubt. We had been counting on the $20 million for the MS research program through the Department of Defense, and to see it be arbitrarily zeroed out, as they would say, was really disappointing and not consistent, I think, with the intent and the spirit of the legislation that funded those programs, and really set us back. The ongoing sort of turbulence at the National Institutes of Health creates further uncertainties about sustaining our leadership as a global medical research leader. And this is one of the things that I think is so important, is that it's not just about MS. This is about our global leadership as an innovator in new therapies, new treatments. The United States is an engine for that when it comes to medical care. I think turbulence there really creates uncertainty. And, the downstream effects of it are, young scientists, individuals thinking about a career in science going like, yeah, no, not going to do that. And you don't see the effects of that today. You see the effects of that 5, 8, 10 years from now, when we don't have as many scientists doing the innovative research we need. And so, these kinds of short-term decisions that have long-term impact really worry me, and really not keeping an eye. It's critical that our legislators keep an eye on the future.
Could not agree more. While we're talking about challenges, what are the biggest challenges you foresee in the MS landscape, and how is the National MS Society preparing to address them.
So are we talking about Washington or just challenges research? Give me a steer.
I'll say any or all of the above, frankly.
Yeah. So obviously we're very concerned about continued reductions in funding for the National Institutes of Health and the MS research program at the Department of Defense. So our activists are proactively engaging congressmen to ask them to act in a responsible manner, ensure that we sustain our research leadership, both in MS, but also in beyond. We're deeply concerned also that Medicaid could be reduced. And Medicaid, is a very important program to people with MS. We estimate that nearly 150,000 people with MS have some form of benefits coming from Medicaid. That's a significant disruption. And I think that we are really urging legislators to really pay attention to these kinds of effects going forward. We're watching closely about the impacts of all the changes in Washington on the FDA and its approval of drug treatments and what it means there. So another area of concern. This is where it's so important that for your audience, if they live in the United States and haven't already signed up to become an MS activist, just go to the National MS Society's website and you can sign up to become an MS activist, and you can receive updates from us. You can engage with us and be part of finding the solutions and really raising your voices to do that. And I'll harken back to Sylvia Lowry. When she was 34 years old, just 34 years old, she was up on Capitol Hill advocating for what eventually became the National Institutes of Neurological Diseases and Stroke, which to this day has invested billions of dollars in all sorts of brain research, hundreds and hundreds of millions of which went to MS. She was the original MS activist, and I would ask your audience to, if they haven't already, to join us in becoming part of that movement that she started so many years ago.
Well, I appreciate you extending that invitation, because my audience may be growing weary of hearing me say it every single week now for the last couple of months. So we're on the same
now
page
more than
there.
ever. It's important for your audience to make your voice heard. There's opportunities both at the federal level, at the state level, and to really become engaged, because you just never know when a person might find themselves sitting in an airport next to a congressman who maybe doesn't know anything about MS, and you could be the person that gets that person thinking. So often, this is the part that I think we often doesn't get seen. It's very personal, one-to-one connections, and you just never know the influence somebody can have. At some point that is just unexpected.
I've actually experienced that exact scenario several years ago, where I found myself in an airport in Washington, D.C., and there happened to be a senator standing next to me. And I struck up what became a great conversation with him that has led to long-term relationship, where I email his office. He is not my senator, but we know each other. And so I stay in touch, and they stay in touch with me. It's been a very, very beneficial situation where I can make sure he is up to date on what's happening in terms of the MS community and what we need from him. Well, while we're talking about challenges, switching gears from advocacy to research, what do you see the challenges in the MS research landscape in the near term?
So obviously funding is a big challenge, and I worry that if we don't sustain our investments in MS research, the discoveries like the oligoclonal glands, like all of our disease modifying treatments, will get slowed down, and that really, in the long term, will slow down the incredible progress we have seen in MS. So I worry about that. But it's not just about treatments. It's also about investing in research, for example, to help us use MRIs more effectively to monitor the disease, to diagnose the disease. We've made discoveries, research that was funded by the National MS Society and the National Institutes of Health, made the discovery that when you look at MS lesions, particularly newer lesions, with an MRI, people are used to seeing the white spots. And yes, you look at it with white spots, but when you use some of the newer technology, you can also see that in the middle of that white spot, there's a vein. And MS lesions typically have a vein. You might say, okay, Tim, that's awesome. Nice to nerd out with you about, veins, but why do we care? Why we care is that, those veins tell you that that lesion is tied to MS. That person that, and so that spot is an MS lesion. That technology is helping us diagnose MS faster because now doctors can say, okay, it's not just a white spot. It's a white spot with a vein in the middle of it. This person has MS. Let's not wait 6 months to diagnose them. We can diagnose them today. That's what we need to diagnose MS in hours rather than months or years. And so that was all, again, very fundamental research that was studying people who were willing to have doctors scan their brains, every month. And that's the kind of research we need. If we want biomarkers that can let us do a blood test to monitor MS, well, that requires very kind of fundamental research to say what would be a marker that would make sense. Is it available in the bloodstream? Can we develop a test that can be done in a hospital to quickly test it? All of that is research. And all of the things we take for granted today about the excellent healthcare we can receive in this country, albeit expensive, has come as a result of investments in research. So this is why I worry about instability. It's not just about money; it's about ensuring stability, because the more unstable a system becomes, that creates disincentives for people to become doctors and researchers, and none of us want that.
I appreciate you kind of walking us through your vision of the world in the hopefully not too distant future a few moments ago. Let me ask you this. What is the one thing you wish more people understood about multiple sclerosis?
So one thing I wish people understood, that anybody can get multiple sclerosis. And oftentimes there have been narratives about who can and can't get MS. Anybody can get this disease. I want people to know that, people young, people old can be diagnosed with the disease. But I'd also want them to know that unlike, Sylvia's story with Bernard, that in today's world, a person living with MS has more treatments, more effective doctors and treatment and care than we've ever seen before, better tools to diagnose and monitor the disease, and life-changing treatments available today for some and more coming. The world is just so profoundly different. And the MS of today can be treated and managed, whereas 30, 40 years ago, people still felt like, can we make a difference? Today, we are making a difference. And the reason we're making a difference has been because of the investments in science and doctors, but also because people continue the line that Sylvia started. Her band of 50 volunteers formed a national organization that came together across the country, that is still coming together across the country. We have a global movement of MS organizations all pulling together to make the world better and to ultimately close MS. And I'd say that is just incredible. And that if we can just continue our focus and continue to be determined to not leave anybody behind, we will close the chapter. We will close the book on MS.
Well, Dr. Tim Coetzee, I want to thank you for your leadership. Thank you for sharing your vision of a world that I think everyone affected by MS wants to live in. And thanks so much for talking with me today.
Oh, great to be with you, John. Let's do this again at the 500th podcast.
That's going to wrap up this 400th episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society. And you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/400. You'll find that link in today's show notes, so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. And if you have a minute, I hope you'll visit the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free RealTalk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or tablet. It's the best way for us to stay connected. The app will automatically download the latest episode of RealTalk MS. You'll be able to access any of our past episodes. You'll be able to save your favorite episodes. And it's a great way for me to share bonus content with you. The app is free, so I hope you'll download it today. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.